Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, I just thought that I would talk about this little conversation. I thought that it would be interesting, and I thought that it needed to be talked about. So, I said, why not talk about it today? Anyways, for those of you that have not recently heard, the prolonged Terence Crawford Manny Pacquiao negotiations, the fight that apparently was so set on happening next, is apparently not going to happen. Now, I said this before, I had my doubts about this fight happening, but apparently what had happened is that there was no funding for the fights. Not only that, but apparently there was an 80-20 split deal for Manny Pacquiao, of course having the advantage in that deal. And apparently Terence Crawford decided not to sign off on that, and Manny Pacquiao had signed the contract. Terence Crawford had not signed the contract. So of course you're going to have a certain amount of people that allege that Terence Crawford is now avoiding a Manny Pacquiao. And I'm here overall to give my objective and logical spin on things here and now. Listen, when it comes to the majority of the videos that I end up reviewing or I end up talking about on my channel, you'll notice that, excuse me, you'll notice that I review a certain amount of the LDBC and New Media's videos. Now, New Media is really the main channels that try to push Terence Crawford as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter, because they have a very pro-racial agenda. There are some members of the LDBC that like Terence Crawford, but if you were going to ask them who their #1 pound-for-pound fighter is, it would most likely be Errol Spence, because they're probably pro-PBC first and then pro-racial second. But make no mistake about it, both the LDBC and New Media are pro-racial. There is no mistake about it. But overall, when it comes down to it, if you just had to ask me the question, do I believe that Terence Crawford avoided a Manny Pacquiao by turning down the contract? Well, I'm going to say is this. First of all, to me, it's not really a huge deal because there was no funding for the fight. So it didn't seem like the fight was going to happen anyway. But the things about Terence Crawford is that if he turned this because this was an 80-20 split. Now, personally, in my opinion, an 80-20 split would be a little bit too much. But if Manny Pacquiao and Terence Crawford were to get into a pay-per-view fight, which of course that would be a pay-per-view fight, Terence Crawford might have to accept that even at this point in time in his career against the Manny Pacquiao, that Terence Crawford may be the B-side in that fight. Because Terence Crawford with the fighters that he has been fighting, with the Idris Velasquez, with the Jose Benavidez, juniors, with all these fighters that are B and C class fighters, he's not going to be the A-side over a Manny Pacquiao or an Errol Spence Jr., and that's why all the Terence Crawford fans, they can sit here, bitch, moan, and complain, saying that Terence Crawford, he's the boogeyman, he's avoided. If Terence Crawford really was 100% serious about facing these guys, he would have signed with the PBC a very long time ago. Now, apparently his top-ranked contract is going to be over this year. So I'm hoping to see Terence Crawford sign with the PBC. If he does not sign with the PBC, then we know the true answer, that Terence Crawford was never interested in facing these big boy welterweights in the first place, because that really is the main barrier. Now, from what I'm hearing, Terence Crawford could potentially get a Sean Porter fight or a Virgil Ortiz fight, but there's no guarantee that he's even going to get one of those fights. And even if he were to beat a Sean Porter or a Virgil Ortiz next, that still probably does not put him as the A-side over Errol Spence Jr., and still probably not even over Manny Pacquiao, because all the A-side means is who's worth more money. And Manny Pacquiao, even at this point in time in his career, I believe is worth more money than what Terence Crawford is, at least debatably, especially ever since his most recent win over Keith Thurman. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that. Some of you may disagree. But New Media especially has tried to promote Terence Crawford as this big, huge superstar. The biggest superstars in all of boxing right now, and a certain amount of people may not like it, the #1 that I would say is out there is either Anthony Joshua or Canelo Alvarez. Those are the ones to where when you take a look at their numbers, when you take a look at the ticket sales, when you take a look at everything, they're always usually sold out. They do the best amount of numbers. All right, Errol Spence Jr., he also does very, very well. Manny Pacquiao, even at this point in time, he still does very well. He is still a name that attracts, a lot of customers. Terence Crawford is just one of those guys that he's a very great fighter, and a lot of people recognize his name, but because of the class of competition that he usually faces, he has not really become that big of a draw. And it's really his own fault why he has not become that big of a draw, because once again, he could have signed with the PBC many years ago and decided to face the big boys over at welterweight. So how serious is Terence Crawford really about facing these guys? Now, when we talk about his next potential fight, what I'm hearing, at least from the channels that want Terence Crawford to be in a big fight next, what I'm hearing is that overall there's a possible chance that he could face a Sean Porter next, or that he could face a Virgil Ortiz. But how likely is that to actually happen? We've already heard Terence Crawford say that he's not overtly interested in facing Virgil Ortiz, and when it comes down to Sean Porter, I'm not sure if that's going to happen either. Because if you're a Sean Porter, what Bob Arum might offer you in terms of money, you might get that same amount of money for fighting Terence Crawford as you would be fighting a Danny Garcia. So who the hell knows if Sean Porter is going to take that risk to face a Terence Crawford or not? Now, of course, some people would say, well, then that would mean that Sean Porter is scared to face Terence Crawford because Terence Crawford is the champion. Whatever you want to allege. Bottom line is this. It would be much more difficult to turn down a Terence Crawford fight if it was going to be worth more money, if there was more funding behind it, because they were over at the PBC, because they have more money behind their stable. And that is the problem with Terence Crawford. He needs to really get out of Top Rank immediately because there are none of the big boy welterweights over there besides Terence Crawford. He has 0 A-class wins in the welterweight division so far. Really, when we want to talk about it, he has 0 A-class wins in his whole entire career. Maybe you want to count Victor Postal or Yuriorkis Gamboa, but even those wins are debatably not A-class, and a certain amount of people would disagree. But when it comes down to it, that's the bottom line about Terence Crawford. It is really a big part. He's a big part of the problem. He kind of stands in his own way because he's not a big gate attraction, and staying with Top Rank, I think, really has hurt him. So it is what it is. We'll see what happens. But Terence Crawford later on down the line, if he wants these big fights with Errol Spence Jr., if he wants these big fights with Manny Pacquiao, he is probably going to have to accept that he is not the A-side for these fights. I don't want to hear Terence Crawford say this bullshit. Well, they're pricing themselves out. I want a 50-50 split. Terence, you're not going to get a 50-50 split. Floyd Mayweather Jr. at one point in time against Oscar De La Hoya, even though he was the undefeated champion at the time, he knew that Oscar was worth more money. I believe Floyd maybe even took a 80-20-70-30 split. Terence Crawford may have to do that against a Manny Pacquiao. He may even have to take a 70-30 split over an Errol Spence Jr. if he truly wants to face them. And that's exactly what Terence Crawford is going to have to do. He may have to take the B side in order to face one of these fighters. And if he does not do that, I'm not really sure how serious he is about facing them. Now, I would not say that he deserves to take the B side over a Sean Porter, but that's going to have to be at least a 60-40 split. And I'm not sure if Sean Porter is going to look at the money that Top Rank offers him as enough. Terence Crawford really has put himself in a very big hole that he may not be able to get out of because there's a lot of big fights that have really slipped his grasp because he has been with Top Rank. And because overall he seems to be making stupid decisions and thinking overall that he is worth way more than what he actually is. And that is pretty much my opinion on the situation. I'm really hoping, I'm really praying we get to see a Sean Porter fight next. That would be the biggest win of his career. I'm also really hoping that maybe we get a Virgil Ortiz fight. Personally, I don't think that that's as good as a Sean Porter fight, but it's better than nothing. But if I had to guess, most likely, who his next opponent is going to be, unfortunately, I would probably have to say Josecito Lopez. And I'm betting money that I'm right. New media, and apparently, some of the other channels out there that like to push Terence Crawford, they're really saying that one of these big fights are going to happen. Well, we'll see about that. Because one thing that they're not willing to admit is that Terence Crawford really kind of screwed himself over by signing with Top Rank. And in my opinion, Terence Crawford cannot be the #1 pound-for-pound fighter until he starts beating some of these bigger names. And that's the bottom line. You can never be the #1 pound-for-pound fighter when you have never even faced a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter, whether people like to admit that or not. And that is the bottom line. Once again, when you take a look at all the fighters that have been recently ranked #1 pound-for-pound, or at least been in the discussion, Canelo Alvarez fought Gennady Golovkin, who was a top 5 pound-for-pound fighter. When you take a look at Floyd Mayweather fought, throughout his career, a multitude of top 10 pound-for-pound fighters. Fought Diego Corrales. Miguel Cotto at one point in time was a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter. Obviously, he fought Manny Pacquiao. When you take a look at Andre Ward fought Carl Froch. He also fought Sergey Kovalev, who were top 10 pound-for-pound fighters. he beat both of them. Terence and Lomachenko even. Lomachenko fought Gan Morrigan. Now, once again, Terence Crawford, for certain people that try to allege that he's the number one pound for pound, I don't know how you can be the number one pound for pound when you've never faced a top 10 pound for pound fighter in your career. There's a debate that he's never even faced a top 20 pound for pound fighter in his career, but some people would debate that. It is what it is. Anyways, that is my opinion on the situation. If Terence really wants these big fights, he has to absolutely leave Top Rank this year. I think, in my opinion, we're going to see how serious Terence Crawford actually is by the way he handles certain deals and by the way he handles Top Rank. He needs to leave Top Rank, in my opinion. And if he does face a Manny Pacquiao, excuse me, or an Errol Spence next, in my opinion, he may have to accept that he's going to be the B side for those fights. And that is just the opinion, that is just my opinion on the situation. So we'll see what happens. Anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.